Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Buzzword, How to Integrate ESG into Your Compliance Strategy. My name is France Aw, and I'm a consultant here at ClauseMatch, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. Before we get started, we just have a few housekeeping items to share. All attendees except the panelists are going to be muted. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box and they will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Lastly, an email with the slides and the recording are going to be sent out to you tomorrow afternoon. We'd like to start by sharing a little bit about our company, ClauseMatch. If this is your first time learning and hearing about us, we are an award-winning regulatory technology company that helps organizations automate their compliance processes. So we support organizations across the board from large tier 1 banks such as Barclays and BlackRock to fintechs and also smaller organizations. We have offices in the US, UK, and also in Singapore, and our clients span across 65 plus countries. So that's a little bit about ClauseMatch. Now let's introduce our speakers. I'm joined today by a great group of subject matter experts in the compliance industry. These panelists have a wide range of knowledge across ESG from North America to EMEA. We're very excited that they're here and joining us. So we'll have each of them quickly introduce themselves, starting with Jason.
All right, so I'm Jason Mefford. I'm an executive. I put executive coach. I wear a lot of different hats, literally and figuratively, but have been involved in the GRC space for a long time, which is where this kind of comes in because it's like we're reliving the past again. So I might refer to some things. I'm old enough to remember some things that had happened before. But really, I work a lot with executive coaches, so people that are executives in these different GRC functions, helping to coach them, but also kind of provide some advisory work. Because a lot of times, we think we have to conform. We don't have to conform. And a lot of times the right answer is the answer that people have not even thought about. So help people to be able to think about that, ask the right questions so that they don't waste a bunch of time and money. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm sure you'll get to know more as we get going.
Awesome, thank you. Sarah?
Hello there. Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about this webinar today. Great title, Beyond the Buzzword. So I founded Change Gap a couple of years ago, and we do consulting. We also do RegTech in the field of regulatory reporting. There's an ecosystem, so looking at some of the other capabilities required. And we also get asked to do RegTech advisory with our consulting clients. And then we do advocacy work in groups. So those three things go together in a purpose-led company. So yeah, we're really excited about all areas of risk and regulation, and ESG is definitely one of those macro topics in that space.
Thank you, Sarah. John?
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be on the panel and to share my thoughts with you on this awesome topic. My background is in digital transformation and business transformation. So I've been working with clients across both public and private sector, predominantly in digital, but increasingly more recently, looking at the value that RegTech can offer in terms of harmonizing between policies, regulations, and just generally getting things done when it comes to dealing with some of the big societal challenges that we grapple with both as individuals, as organizations, companies, and governments.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so now let's take you through today's agenda. We're going to dive into how you can help your organization best prepare for the new ESG regulations coming your way. including the upcoming SEC climate-related disclosures. Then we'll provide tips on how to embed an ESG mindset into your compliance strategy. And finally, we'll conclude with how leading organizations are adapting to RegTech to meet their ESG obligations. So these are going to be the three topics that we'll be discussing today. So first, before we jump into the topics for today, I'd like to set the stage by just giving a quick overview of ESG. As I'm sure everyone here already is aware of what ESG is, I'll just quickly cover again to give an overview and set the stage to discuss what ESG is, where did it come from, and also why it's important. So just as with how GRC came to be, a lot of the elements have been in practice for quite some time, but until it was really coined, did it become a practice, right? So the same can really be said about ESG, where it's been around through some shape or fashion through corporate social responsibility elements, right? A definition I quite like is ESG is a generic term used in capital markets, used by investors to evaluate corporate behavior and to determine financial performance of companies, right? So really, realistically, what it boils down to is it's the measurable version of CSR for investment purposes, if you want to think about it that way. It took shape around January 2004 when the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan invited over 50 CEOs of large financial institutions to take part in a joint initiative to talk about ESG. So if there was an equation for ESG, it would look something like this. It's taking all of the goodness and building upon the corporate social responsibility efforts that a lot of organizations have been doing for quite some time, and really adding some focus and adding some metrics behind it to give you ESG, right? So after all, you can't truly manage what you don't measure. So what I'll say about this slide is just it's more illustrative. There's obviously a lot of different areas and aspects to ESG. A lot of focus is given to the E in ESG, but it's also important to not neglect the S. So organizations that have ESG embedded into their compliance strategy, their governance framework, can experience a lot of benefits. Obviously, some of these benefits are going to differ widely depending on the stakeholder's perspective. But here are just some that I'd like to highlight. I won't go through everything in general in detail, but by having an ESG embedded into your organization, you'll be more attracted to investment opportunities. You'll have better performance, definitely with financial performance there. You'll be more adaptable and be prepared for any kind of regulations that might be popping up or disruptive technologies. And lastly, by having ESG embedded into your strategy, you'll be more innovative and also promote brand image, a positive one. All right, so let's jump into our first topic, our first part 1 of 3 on how to prepare for ESG. So I'll ask these questions to Jason. The first question we have on the list is, from your perspective, what are the top things organizations are thinking about when it comes to ESG?
I think, France, like you said, most people, when you think about it, I like that formula, CSR plus sustainability equals ESG, right? But it seems like at least most of the people that I'm talking to, they're mainly focusing on the E, right? Which again has been around for a long time. And while yes, that is a big deal, I think a lot of people are ignoring the S side of it. And in my opinion, the S is actually your bigger risk. And it's the bigger area where a lot of things need to be done, but a lot of people are kind of forgetting it. But I also know it's a big topic, right? And so because it's a big topic, you've got to take it, with these little pieces as you're going along. And so yes, a lot of companies, especially ones that are in, let's say, natural resource companies, they already know, they've already been getting a lot of pressure about their environmental impact, and so they've already been focusing on that. And especially from an investor perspective, right, it's one of the reasons why investors are pushing this is they don't like unknown liabilities. And so they don't want to, they're valuing a company based on, what they think potential future liabilities are going to be. And so if you have a natural resource company that's doing, let's say, environmental practices that are not the best, and all of a sudden you have, I don't know, an oil spill in the ocean, and you've got billions of dollars of liability, that really pisses off the investors, right? Because they lost a lot of money. And I totally get that. But I think what a lot of people are ignoring are some of the things around the social side of it, which in my opinion, when it comes to our impact on society, the employees, our local communities, which we started talking about with CSR, but it was really pretty superficial. But to me, those are a lot of the bigger things that we're going to be talking about for the next 20 years, because those things are going to start coming to the surface. And if people don't really consider those and really take those at what they are, I think a lot of companies are going to be very, very surprised. So what I'm seeing is, again, a lot of companies are focusing on the E and they're ignoring the S, which I think that's wrong. But, again, everybody's got to decide what's right for themselves, right? Which again kind of goes into, I know we've talked about this before, of a lot of companies are not asking why. And why is a very important question to ask, right? Because for a while we've been talking about it with things like risk management as well. Everybody thinks, oh, risk management, it's competitive advantage, that's why I have to do it. No, 80% of the people are doing risk management because they see it as compliance, because everybody else is expecting them to do it. They're not really using it as a competitive advantage. They're not doing it because they believe it's the right thing to do. They're just trying to check a box. And so for a lot of people in this ESG space, right, that's why I actually encourage a lot of people to kind of wait. Don't get so excited of what everybody else is doing right now, right? And just go do it because you think you have to do it, right? Which kind of reminds me, like when I was growing up, my dad would always tell me, would you do something just because everybody else is doing it, right? And he's like, if everybody was running around naked, would you run around naked? And I'm like, well, actually, I might, Dad. but the other one, if everybody was jumping off a cliff, would you do it? Well, no, I probably wouldn't do that, right? So stopping and asking one of those questions of, why are we doing this? Are we doing it because everybody is expecting us to do it, and it's really just another thing from a compliance perspective we have to do? If that's the case, then there's a certain pathway you'd want to go down. If it's no, you know what, we really believe in ESG. We think that businesses need to they have a responsibility in our society. And if they do harm to society, they need to pay for it. They need to actually be tracking and showing their actual impact on society. And we think that's the right thing to do. If you actually really believe that is the right thing to do, then it's so much more than just reporting, and tracking numbers that you're reporting to the public or to investors.
Yeah, that's great, Jason. It's very good points there, and helps to clarify and make it important to their organization. So that kind of leads to the next question. So once they have that, what are some of the things that they should be considering to prepare for ESG?
Well, there's the whole, because I know our third bullet point on here is like the SEC regulations. And so, yeah, if you're a publicly traded company in the United States, you've got to be aware of what the SEC is going to do, because there's probably going to be some of these new reporting things that you have to report on. So, what that's going to be, a lot of this stuff is still in flux. And I think that's another reason why, unless you're getting significant pressure from your investors, from the street, if you're publicly traded. And again, that's probably going to be more the companies that are publicly traded and in a lot of these spaces, especially where they have a significant environmental impact. Okay. The rest of us, we can kind of sit back and wait until something happens, right? So people are pointing to the SEC regulations. We've seen this from CSR, in the past as well, because like I said, I'm old enough now that I've lived through several of these phases. And right now there's a lot of confusion over, well, what are the right metrics? What are the things I need to be tracking? What are the things I need to be doing? And nobody's agreeing on it right now. There's a lot of different groups saying, well, our way of doing it is the right way and you must do it that way, right? But for the most part, ESG reporting is all voluntary. So you can decide what's important. And what I'm seeing a lot of companies reporting now is just silly to me. Some of the things that they're trying to put out there, it's like it's almost like greenwashing. And when people see it, it just, you talk about the public relations and brand issue before. So I'll tell you this, it was a few years ago. I live in the LA area, and there was one of the largest oil companies in the world had a bunch of billboards around down here, and it was talking about their billboards were, we're investing in future scientists and we're giving all this money to education because we're, creating a better world for these new young people. And then you see their logo on the side and it's like, aren't you an oil company? How does that even make any sense, right? So here they are trying to portray something publicly, but it actually backfires on them, because I'm like, I know that's not who you really are, right? You're, robbing, raping, and pillaging Mother Earth, right? I mean, is how some people would look at it because you're an oil company. And so, as you're looking at that, you've got to think about, and I think we'll talk more about that, of the things that you're actually going to be sharing, and you're not going to just do what everybody else is doing, because that doesn't make any sense. Now, from an SEC standpoint, or when it becomes compliance in nature, then you do have to actually follow and do what they're asking you to do. And so for those companies, you do have to be watching, seeing what it is and preparing yourself, because a lot of these numbers are not something that you would have necessarily tracked or have included in your financial numbers. So you're going to have to figure out, where does that data exist, right? What is it? How do we calculate it? And then how do we make sure that it's actually the right number? So that's where compliance, and especially people like audit, are going to come in, is before you issue some numbers publicly, you better make sure that they're right, because somebody's going to come check. And again, we've seen this with CSR play out, where companies will publicly, throw numbers out there. They will say certain things like, we're going to reduce our carbon footprint by 10% in the next 10 years. And so, an NGO organization says, okay, and we're going to hold you to it, because we're actually going to look and we're going to see what you're reporting, and we're going to figure out if we think you're actually lying to us or not. Right. So again, these are all some of the things that companies need to be considering before they just jump into the deep end of the pool.
Yeah, and that's a really great perspective. And I think you you asked, you answered the third question in your response there, and you essentially touched on the G part, the governance aspect, and how important that is, and their assurance partners and those different functions play in this whole ESG piece. So Thank you for that. All right, so let's move on to part two. Our second topic here, we'll talk about tips on how to embed an ESG mindset into your compliance strategy. All right, so the first question here, and you kind of alluded to it, Jason, and I'll ask you these questions as well. You started talking on the topic of defining ESG and what it means to the organization. From your perspective, how can organizations go about defining it for them?
Yeah, so I think, again, and part of this is about strategy, right? So again, I think so much of the time we forget, and most of the people on the call, I understand you're a tactician, right? You're given a list of stuff that you got to do, you just got to go do it, right? You may not be involved in the strategy decisions themselves, but the organizations really have to think about, what do you stand for, right? And I think a lot of times there's, and it's okay. Right, this is another thing that people don't address or don't say, so I'm going to say it here, right? Is you may not agree with people robbing, raping, and pillaging Mother Earth, okay? But some people, they're fine with that, right? I mean, some organizations are fine with it. Some people are fine with it. And so there is a group of people that, if you're an organization and you want to do things that maybe other people don't like, it's okay. And you can say no. I mean, that's the thing with compliance in general. You can decide not to do something. There's consequences, right? Like there may be a whole segment of the society that doesn't want to do business with you, that's not going to buy a product from you, right? And again, all of you that are on the call, think about it. There's certain companies that you won't do business with now, and you're probably never going to do business with them. In fact, there's two large banks in the US. I will never do business with these two banks because of experiences that I've had, because of some things that they did. If they come out and they tell me all the ESG stuff, I'm not even going to listen to them because I don't even care. But there's plenty of people that do want to do business with them, and that's fine too, right? So what do you stand for, right? It's like that old country song, if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, right? So what is it that companies really, really believe in, and what is important to them, right? Because, again, a lot of companies, the E is not going to be a big deal for them because they don't have an environmental impact. So you're going to want to focus more on the S if that's what's important to you, right?
Mm.
But each organization, and this is where it's so confusing and frustrating for people. And I know this because I've been in the GRC space for 20 plus years, right? And again, people are like, I just want a checklist. I just want to tell me exactly what I have to do for GRC. Well, every organization is going to do it a little bit different. And so you got to figure out, how are you going to define it? What does it mean to you? How does that fit into your strategy? Right. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of new companies that are coming out now that they stand for certain things, and their customer base knows it. They know, and they're willing to pay a little bit more money for it. And so if you're one of those companies, then you're going to want to align all the stuff you're doing with the ESG into your strategy. If not, if you're just doing it for compliance, then it probably doesn't matter as much. Tick the boxes, make the people in the market happy, and just go about doing your business, right? But the companies who really get this, and this is one thing I know we were talking about the other day, is companies who really get ESG and really believe it, they're willing to earn less money because it's the right thing to do. And I think a lot of companies, when they really look at themselves in the mirror, they don't really believe it because they're not willing to do the things that it takes to actually be that kind of a company.
Mhm. Yeah, it sounds like it's definitely very important to align when folks are thinking about ESG. To summarize what you just said, really there's a lot of importance to line up with their mission, vision, and values, and also their strategic objectives, or else it's just going to fall flat on its face, and you're just ticking another box, right?
Yeah,
Great.
and like I said, there's going to be a lot of companies that, you know what, whether you want to do it or not, you got to tick the box. I mean, if you're going to be a publicly traded company in the US, the SEC says you've got to do this reporting. It becomes a cost of doing business, right? Just like any other compliance thing happens to be. But if you really believe it, you're not going to do the minimum, right? And you're going to be looking at other things that maybe companies wouldn't normally think about. We were talking about packaging a couple of days ago too, right? The way products get delivered, the packaging, that's a huge E part of it. But a lot of people, do they really think about it, right? And so anyway, well,
Yeah.
this kind of comes back as, again, like the third bullet, right? ESG vision internally and externally. You got to have some of those almost soul searching discussions of what is it that we really do stand for? How do we want to be seen? What's the true impact that we want to have on the planet? Right. And this goes back to some of the earlier stuff from a CSR perspective. One of the terms that was kicked around a lot is the 3 Ps, right? People, profit, planets. And how do we, balance all of that together? And that's really the deeper discussion. I know a lot of people now are freaking out because of the compliance side of it, but I'm just trying to also raise some of the other questions that companies really should be asking themselves, instead of how do we comply with it? How do we report on it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Jason, can I just chip in there? Because I think that 3 Ps is really good. Maybe it's 4 or 5 Ps. I mean, personally, I don't see how people can achieve ESG without purpose.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you're just kind of, following rather than leading, and, following others which have a different business model and set of objectives and so on. And maybe principles comes into it. I like your point about, people saying, oh, just give me a checklist. And, but it's like, if you could, like, should you? Because no, because then that defeats the whole object. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's room enough in this world for everybody, right? And ultimately, the bad players eventually have to pay for what they've done, right? So eventually, the government, somebody else is going to come in. They're going to make people clean up stuff. They're going to make that stuff happen, right? I mean, that it takes a long time, and there's damage that's done. I think it's much better to just do it right to begin with, right? But there's companies who sell $4 t-shirts because they're probably getting them from some sweatshop. But there's people who are willing to buy $4 t-shirts. There's also people who are willing to spend $100 for a t-shirt, right? And those are two different companies, two different kind of markets behind them as well. Both can coexist, but which company do you want to be? And if you're the sweatshop kind of company, then own it, right? Just like be honest about it with people is kind of my take on it, and let people know. But that's getting a little more philosophical. I'll pull it back here.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. So once they've kind of defined what's important to them, right, which is kind of the first topic that you highlighted, right? Is there any tips or strategies from your perspective, or even from the other panelists, on how organizations out there could employ to make things easier from an ESG standpoint? How they, and it kind of blends into the third bullet point we have here also, in communicating that, right? So what are your thoughts and perspectives and experiences there?
Yeah, so this is where, technology really does come in, because a lot of these things, it's one thing when you look at, a business, for things that you're only doing once, twice a year, maybe, you don't need a lot of automation behind a lot of those sorts of things, right? But when you're starting to look at a lot of things like this that kind of goes into these KPIs and some of these other metrics that we're going to start tracking, what gets measured, right, gets done, kind of a thing, right? Kind of the Peter Drucker, quote, paraphrasing from before, right? So if you want people to take certain actions, you got to measure it, and then you got to hold people accountable to it. And so, a lot of these things that you're going to come up with, once you've kind of figured out what it is that you stand for, what it is that you're trying to do with this, again, folding in a lot of those compliance requirements that could come from, like I said, people like the SEC. Obviously, once one government or one regulator does it, it starts to roll out in other parts of the world. So again, don't think that, you're in Germany, so you don't have to worry about it. It's probably going to come to Germany or the EU as well, right? So, but you can start to get an idea of what is possibly coming by what some of these other groups are doing. Or you can also just do some of the voluntary stuff. But what you're talking about is there's going to be a lot of data. There's a lot of transactions. There's a lot of things that are happening. And it's really impossible to keep track of all of these things and be able to quickly report on them unless you have technology in place, right? Because you just can't do it. I mean, you've got to release numbers, quickly. And also, it's not just from a reporting perspective, but it's also from a performance management perspective, right? If you think about companies managing their performance, they're using technology, right, to be able to help them in holding people accountable and responsible and making sure that they're achieving, right, the progress towards whatever it is that they happen to be doing. So technology really does come into that, and then trying to figure out what are the right KPIs for us, how would we calculate it, where's the data at? Is the data telling us what we really think it's telling us? Have we audited it? Are we thinking it's telling us apples when it's telling us oranges? Because a lot of times, again, I mean, I've seen that, as a career as an auditor, a lot of times people believe a number that's on a report. And when you dig into it, you realize, hold it, that's not even telling me what I thought it was telling me.
Yeah, great point. So once they define what's important to them, making sure it lines up with their mission, vision, values, and objectives, then it comes the hard work of defining those, getting the data and figuring out where they stand, right? What is their current KPIs? And that's going to become their essentially their benchmark. So that's really great points there, Jason.
I think just to echo some of the points made, but one thing that I'm seeing more and more of across the businesses I work with is companies not thinking about it in terms of designing an ESG mindset into their compliance strategy, but redesigning their entire businesses to be ESG by default, so they don't have to do so much compliance. And in doing so, they use things like RegTech to keep a track of all the things that they've changed, so that they are now, much more focused on the E, the S, and the G through their default design. So a good example is energy companies. They're moving away from hydrocarbons. They're moving into electric charging. They're moving into hydrogen infrastructure. In 5 years, you're not going to be able to tell that an energy company used to be a carbon-based company. It's all going to be about hydrogen and sustainably sourced electricity. And that shift means that from an ESG perspective, they don't have to do as much legwork to do the compliance reporting because it's there by default.
Well, and it's another way too, Jahan, that a lot of the things right now, especially from reporting, and that's where technology is helping out so much, is I use the analogy, if you go back, because I my degree is in accounting, right? And so if you go back, if you think about what accounting was 100 years ago, it was a whole bunch of people with green shades sitting there doing the ledgers, right? And I used to have to do that by hand sometimes, right? Doing the old green ledgers. And we would have a whole bunch of people sitting around this huge office, right? Balancing the books, literally, right? And then technology comes in. It replaces a lot of the bookkeeping manualness that the people, the humans, had to do. And did it mean that we get rid of all the humans? No. Well, sometimes, I mean, again, if you had a staff of 100 people, maybe now you only need 20. But what's happening is those people then are moving into a higher and better use kind of case, right? So bookkeepers, now become financial analysts, or, there's a word like that, to where now we're kind of checking to make sure, right? And so a lot of the manualness goes away, just like it did in the industrial age, where, again, some of the companies where I used to work at manufacturers, we used to have 1,000 people sitting around peeling potatoes by hand, right? Now you go to the same plant and there's like 2 people watching this big machine do all of the work that all of those people used to do. And that's really, where we're coming from a tech standpoint, of a lot of that heavy lifting that honestly was really boring, for humans to do, is now being able to be done by tech, but also be done in a much more efficient but also effective manner, because it doesn't have once it's working right, you don't have all of the error that sometimes humans bring into the process.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective, guys. So just to kind of wrap up this topic, in the interest of time, kind of to summarize this, it sounds like, what they first need to define the what matters to them, and then leverage technology if they can, to help with the reporting so that they can communicate that internally and externally.
As can I just chip in? I'm going to be a bit controversial because, I stand here as a technologist, we're into RegTech, and of course it can help. But I think the challenge we've got is there's almost like too much tech. So Jason, you drew the comparison from your early days, and actually my first job was when there was no computers. I used to go into the office, fold bank statements, and have to do everything by hand. So yes, we've improved, but then equally you've got these almost intractable problems because the scale is so huge, and the interconnectedness of us now globally. It's great we're on a global webinar now, but it causes other issues. And also the point around you can't measure what you can't manage, or manage what you can't measure. So of course, yeah, it's the right thing to be coming up with ratings, benchmarks, reporting, and so on. But equally, it's premature because there's still such a way to go in terms of the definition, and also one size fits none. So large institutions versus small. So there's many mountains to climb. So I'm interested in perspective of is it too early, or is it a case of start soon and lean on external help so that you're not going it alone?
Well, because you bring up a good point that I always which we haven't mentioned. So big companies versus small companies or mid-sized companies, because like you said, you're right. A lot of times the small and mid-sized companies think that they have to do this huge investment into it, and it's probably not the right thing for them to do at the time. To be more cautious, to go into it, to have some help in trying to figure it out. But I think the other tech is like it's two-edged sword, because sometimes we end up believing the computer. So I'll just give you a simple story. When I was going through my divorce, many years ago, we had to separate bank accounts. Okay. So my ex-wife had called and was trying to do some different things, and the card company or the bank wouldn't believe that she was who she was. So she had to go into the local branch. She was sitting in front of a banker, had her passport in front of her. And the person in the customer service department was asking the local banker questions to validate that my ex-wife was who she said she was. But she kept answering the questions wrong, right? Because it was pulling in from all these different sources on the internet, asking her questions, and she was apparently giving the wrong answers because the person kept saying, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's not the right answer. Are you really sure you're who you are?" And I remember that, the local banker's like, "She's sitting right in front of me. I see her passport. This is the right person," right? That sometimes, things can get so complex, they can get so confusing sometimes, right? Because we make them more confusing than they need to be, or more complex than they need to be, because we got technology, and I love technology. Don't get me wrong, right? But don't just take it at face value, right? That's why those bookkeepers became analysts, to like double check, right? And make sure that what we're actually getting is really the right numbers, and it really is telling us what we think it's telling us. So
Yeah. So it's definitely important to keep up with the change and have change be your best friend. So thank you very much for that. Let's move on to part 3. This is going to be our last topic for today. In the interest of time, we have about 19 more minutes. So in part 3, we are going to be talking about how leading organizations are adapting RegTech to meet their ESG obligations. So for these next questions, I'm going to ask Sarah and Johan, but as always, any of the panelists, please feel free to hop in. So for the first one, Sarah, you were talking about RegTech and technology. How has GRC RegTech evolved in response to ESG from what you've seen out there? What are some of the trends? What's going on with technology?
Okay, thank you. I would say it's very much evolving rather than evolved. We're right at the start. I've seen literally hundreds of new, data providers or RegTechs, FinTechs, startups pop up in response to ESG, and the amount of investment into ESG providers, as opposed to the previous slices of the RegTech pie, has just ballooned, which is great in some way, but it makes it very noisy and very fragmented and very confusing for firms. And if firms haven't even realized they need to set out their purpose and their position in terms of ESG, then how can you possibly go about selecting and procuring RegTech? So it's evolving. I would pick out 3 things, right? So GRC in itself, even without ESG, is in a state of maturation, or new generation. So the need for interconnected and integrated risk management is huge. How can a firm apply equal or proportionate focus to their cyber risks versus their operational risk versus their financial risk? It's no longer possible to properly manage a business with siloed risk management. So the GRC platforms out there today, I think, are recognizing this need for more connectedness. And let's hope that while they're going about that, ESG is front and center. I think the other thing is transition risk doesn't get mentioned enough. So there's a lot of focus on the various measures, ratings, benchmarks, and so on, and the rush for data. Let's just buy loads of climate data and hope it does great things. But actually, how do you manage that transition? So I think, from my in my humble opinion, from what I've seen and what I can see is needed, there's a real need to work together, to collaborate, because the problem is just so huge. If we're going to make sense globally and individually, of the problem and where we need to get to versus where we are today and how we're going to make an orderly transition and improvement, then I don't see any other way than to collaborate, which is a difficult thing when you've got massive data providers out there trying to lock firms in early to their solution. Okay, so that's my message, evolving, and almost a call to action to adopt a really collaborative mindset.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. That's really great advice there. And thank you for sharing your perspective on what you're seeing in the industry. I think you have some very valuable advice there. So for our last question, I'm going to send this one over your way, Jahan. And earlier you were talking about carbon and hydrocarbons and that kind of industry. So I feel like this would be very appropriate to send your way. One of the things that I think a lot of folks might be thinking about as well are in terms of adapting RegTech, right, to meet those obligations that they might have. How can the industry prepare themselves, whether it's with greenhouse emissions or all the way down to their policy management stuff? So would welcome your thoughts and your experience.
So thank you, Franz. I guess, so if you were to look at decarbonisation, the best way to sort of unpack the challenge is you've got to look at the speed with which we have to decarbonise and the scale at which we need to decarbonise. And the big problem that we've had at COP is that we haven't been able to get sign-off that those things need to happen within those periods of time, and that necessarily our ways of life need to change. Now, once those agreements land, then it's going to be much clearer as to what each country's rules need to be, and how those countries then set their targets to meet those new set their policies to meet those targets. Where GRC and RegTech can really help is it can create a bottom-up flow of saying, okay, all these companies, and we're seeing this already at the moment, with large organizations joining essentially consortiums saying, this is what we're going to do. And it's the companies leading and pushing on those, on the decision makers, on the G aspect of the ESG. And through RegTech, we can almost build a volume to say, do you know what? These are the policies that we think we need to go out and do and be authentic in terms of decarbonizing. And here's what we're going to do within the next 5 years rather than within the next 35 years. So there's this, looking at the scale and looking at the pace of it all, companies can move much faster than governments. And it's that bottom up, that setting out of the policy framework that will drive and move the needle on decarbonisation. Looking at it the other way, where I've worked with governments, they're looking at sandboxes and regulatory mechanisms to stimulate innovation, because what you don't want to do is make the mistake that we've all made previously, which is rushing technology through and not being aware of the byproducts and consequences of technology. So the Industrial Revolution produced lots of things into the into our environment, because it's kind of a it's a commons resource. Nobody really regulated it, and now it's a climate emergency. What we don't want to do is, in fixing the climate, we don't want to break something else. So having that measured response from a policy point of view, I think RegTech is going to play an absolutely fundamental role in making sure that there is consistency between how companies set their policies, but also consistency from the regulator to say we also need to look at unwanted byproducts, like minimized as well. So it's a massive challenge. A good example of industries that are looking at this from a decarbonisation perspective, like tire manufacturers. So the global rubber supply right now is dependent on a single type of rubber tree and monoculture. And if you're invested in rubber, you'd probably want them to divest from that. So they're looking at new practices where they can have generative farming techniques in and around rubber plantations so that they de-risk that crop from essentially fungus and other things wiping it out. Through having more sustainable farming practices in the supply chain, they're actually the tire manufacturers are de-risking their own operations. But also there's a massive ESG uplift in that it gives better jobs for farmers in those countries where they have the rubber plantations, but it also means you can do much better carbon capture through having plantations that are generative rather than monoculture.
Great, thank you very much. Jason, Sarah, do you all have any other, would you like to provide any other comments on that?
I think you kind of to Jahan's point too. I think, again, I mean, this is to get people to think, right? And I know that, like you said, the unintended consequences as well, right? That yeah, it would be nice to say, well, I'll give you a story, right? So one of the restaurant companies that I used to work with, certain products would come in certain packaging, and one of the problems was with the trans fat issue and changing of the oils that were going in this particular product. There was nothing wrong with the packaging, but it would get little oil spots on it, and so the company was concerned that a customer or somebody might see that and think there was something wrong with their product, right, because of the packaging that it was in. And so they're like, well, let's just switch to poly. We'll just use clear poly, right, instead of this other kind of paper issue. And so, somebody was like, we're going to go down this road. This is how we're going to go. Boom, 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 boom. Finally, somebody kind of raised their hand and said, but do you understand some of the other impacts that this is going to have, right? And then they started kind of tearing it apart, looking at it, realizing some of the other unintended consequences, right? More plastic in the environment, right? Instead of a paperish composite, right? The companies that they would put out of business, right? By forcing to go to something else, just like that, right? Is, it's taken us hundreds of years to get ourselves into some of these problems. And while I would love to just like totally clean it, like in a year, we have to be realistic too, right? If it took us hundreds of years to get here, but we've got to start making the progress towards that. So yeah, that's a good point, that for everybody to think about what are some of the unintended consequences that could be happening too. Even when we're trying to do the right thing, we've got to go about it in the right way, because if we don't, there can be massive ramifications on the other side. So
Great, thank you guys. Okay, so we have a few more minutes, so we are going to kick off our Q&A. Just for a few minutes, we'll try to answer whatever questions we can. Whatever we cannot answer, we'll be sure to respond individually after the call. So let's jump into questions. All right. So we have this one question here. What is the difference in terms of GRC activities when you take a tick the box approach versus embedding ESG? So feel free, Jahan, Sarah, Jason.
I think so if you were to embed it in terms of the amount of time and resource you need to spend in demonstrating compliance, it becomes less. If you're using tick box, there's more of it, and there's more information exchange that has to happen. There's more review, assurance, audit. Whereas if the thing's been designed to be compliant by default, what you then have to show is far less. And actually, from a point of view of how well it's embedded into the company culture, you can ask anybody about it. So you're actually creating many more people with that attribute to be able to answer the question about how does this thing work. A good example is an energy company I worked in a number of years ago. The energy industry in the UK decided that they wanted to reduce the number of deaths in the industry to zero. So health and safety became the hottest ticket. And all the energy companies, and this is energy companies involved across the whole value chain of energy, they decided to embed health and safety culture very deeply into the organization, such that if you turned up on a site, you had to reverse park, you had to wear a lanyard at all times, you had to hold handrails going up and down stairs. There was all these, every meeting started with a safety moment. And that then became the culture. Now, when they then got audited for health and safety, it was far easier for them to answer the question as to how they're compliant with the various health and safety ISOs than just being able to kind of go through the checklist and trying to find those information sources. Because by embedding it in that culture, they can essentially ask anybody.
Really great perspective there. And we are, I think we have time to take just one more question, and then we have to wrap up. But this one question is, how important is it to assess ESG risk and opportunities in terms of years? Should it be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later? How far? What does that horizon look like?
People aren't going to like the answer, but it's long term, right? Because actually, I think I saw in one of the chat messages as it was going by too, that one of the reasons this has become such a hot topic is, especially here in the US, we are very quarter driven, right? So we're very short term focused. I mean, if you think about even our structure of government, right? We have a new president every 4 years or every 8 years. We have elections every couple of years. And so we're used to things turning over really quick. We tend to think short term. But you look at some of the other countries in the world, like Queen Elizabeth, how long has she been on the throne, right? How much has she seen over the time? Other places in the world that take a much longer view to it is that, it's about the long term. And if you take shortcuts in the short term, you will pay for it in the long term. That, I think, is one of the things that the governments and the regulators are trying to tell people. And I've seen this for, so many times. We can go back. There's example after example of companies who take shortcuts in the short term and they pay for it big time in the long term. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the executives who made those decisions aren't at those companies anymore. They already cashed out. The investors already cashed out. But, just like the investors are saying, hey, I don't want some big unmitigated liability to come through 2 years from now because of something stupid you've been doing for the last 20 years. We've got to take a longer term view on this and realize it's not about the next quarter. It's not about the next year. There's an old, ancient or Native American kind of concept of thinking about, especially as they call Mother Earth or Pachamama, is think about the impact you're going to have for the next 7 generations. It's not just you, it's not just your kids, but do everything with the thought of how is this going to impact 7 generations from now? That's 150 to 200 years, folks.
Yeah.
So can I just add to that? I think in terms of ESG and making investment choices, I agree with Jason. I think in terms of lobbying governments, action is needed urgently. If you were to look at the science and varying standpoints on, things like grain right now, because of the conflict between US and Ukraine, there's grain shortages in places like the Sahel. And if you've got a supply chain that goes through that part of the world, you're going to be, it doesn't matter what your return on investment window is, the people just aren't going to be there and the environment just won't be there to support it. So we need to secure a stable biosphere in the next 10 to 15 years as an absolute must.
Yeah.
if companies are going to take positions on ESG initiatives and investments, that's fine. But in terms of lobbying governments, we need to be pushing everybody to say, guys, we need to really turn this thing around in the next 5 to 10 years. Otherwise, there's no point in investing beyond 20.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We're right at time, guys. So I wish we could continue longer, but thank you so much to our guests and also our panelists who joined. Just a quick note here, we have some upcoming webinars on Wednesday, June 29th, where we'll be hosting Women in FinTech fireside chat. So if you are interested, please feel free to reach out to us. Also, we're going to have some in-person events in Charlotte and Orlando. If you're happen to be at these events, please feel free to stop by and say hello at our booths. Also in London, if you happen to be there, we'll be doing a workshop on compliance management with Michael Rasmussen. So thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Again, we're going to send this over to you and the recording by tomorrow. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you all.